fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Now we have the dynamic duo of crime. We've got Stephen and Joyce Singular. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Now, we've had you on before and talked all sorts of crime, but now we're going to talk about your book, Unholy Messenger, and it's the life and crimes of the BTK killer, serial killer. Wow. So how did you get involved in this case, first of all?
Well, I grew up in eastern Kansas, and the story, of course, is set in Kansas, just north of Wichita. We were visiting my little, very small hometown in eastern Kansas in June or late May of 2005. Late May, as I say, and BTK had been arrested at the end of February of 2005. I took my son down to play basketball in this gym, and my old coach was there, and he said, "You got to write about the BTK case." And I said, "Well, some other people are probably involved in that." He said, "No, I'm serious." And he took out his phone. He said, "My son was on the investigative task force, or my son-in-law, that investigated BTK for a year after he came out of the woodwork in 2004. And he was part of the arrest team, and he has a very inside view of what went on during that time." I probably lodged some sort of protest. He dialed the number and handed me the phone. And the next day I was in Wichita talking to one of the investigators on the task force that, again, was operating for about a year. So it was a great doorway into seeing the police side of trying to catch this guy. They'd been chasing him for 31 years. And it was the most frustrating thing that the Wichita Police Department had ever been involved in, and most people thought it would never happen, that he would be captured. So that was a very fortunate entry point into the story.
And he was actually there when BTK was arrested,
he
right?
Was.
Yeah,
yes,
and that part of the book is, and it's really, it just leads up to that moment, that the momentum of that point is so dramatic when they finally get him. And they go into his neighborhood, and they surround him, and the Lieutenant Landwehr is in the back seat. It's all very interesting, but we don't want to get too far ahead of the story, of course.
Well, it was just, Wichita as a community, about 300,000 to 400,000 people were just so frustrated by this, and that went on again for 3 decades. And so when it finally happened, there was just this tremendous catharsis.
Now, that's, it's a real interesting case. Now, Dennis Rader, though he was like, the Boy Scout leader and the president of the church and all this stuff, people were really surprised. And listening in your book too, it was, I guess it was the minister of the church was, just couldn't believe it when the police had come with the search warrant. Do you think that people still have that impression that someone like this, that is kind of like a normal person, as they call it, a model citizen, could never be a killer like that? You kind of know what I'm saying?
Well, I think that, he sort of expanded the definition of what a serial killer could be. One of the interesting parts of this is that, as we all know, the FBI started profiling serial killers at the Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico in the mid-'70s. And so this is, 2005. So they had a lot of experience, and they had been brought into this case over the years. And their profile kept saying he's single, he lives alone, he lives in Wichita proper, he's got antisocial behavior that's going to be very obvious in some way, shape, or form, and that's the individual we're looking for. And, of course, everything about it was wrong. So the experts had no idea, who this guy actually was.
And how well he could blend into society.
Yeah, they swabbed again, a little background, but he killed at least 10 people between 1974 and 1991, and then he probably stopped killing because in the early 90s, Kansas brought back the death penalty. And he probably knew that he had left DNA at certain crime scenes, and he had left it at 3. So he finally came back in 2004, back into public view when he started communicating with the police. So they had swabbed 4,500 people in 2004, but they were all in the city of Wichita.
And I think he was naive about how long they could preserve DNA.
That's
and
true.
Just think, if he hadn't left the DNA there, he may not have ever been caught,
Yeah.
Well,
or convicted,
but
anyway.
do you think that he wanted to be caught? A lot of people say that.
I don't.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, he from the very beginning, one of the interesting parts of him was that his first murder, we think, was a spectacular crime in which he went into a house and killed 4 people: mother, father, young daughter, and son. So he about 6 months later, when somebody else came forward and tried to take credit for the crime, he got very angry and he wrote a long letter to the local paper, the Wichita Eagle, saying, "I'm the killer, not these people." And he gave very detailed descriptions of where each body was, what condition, how he tied them up and all of that. So on the one hand, he wanted attention for it. On the other hand, he didn't want to get caught.
But I'd like to answer that also, because when he did get caught, in his confession to the police, he stated that he had been compiling all of his, data and drawings and mementos and souvenirs and everything in what he called the mother lode, and he was going to put them onto CDs, I guess at the time, and then he was going to put them in a safety deposit box so that someday after he was dead, people would know who the real BTK was. I found that very interesting because in court he also expressed deep remorse, for what he did to his family, his wife, all of his relatives, extended family. But yet it's sort of a contradictory because who would have opened up that safety deposit box if not his family? So it was like to me it seemed like he didn't really care even about his family, if that's what he was planning to do to them after he died someday. Of course, I don't believe everything he said either. I think he was a pathological liar too.
Oh, it's interesting. Now, in reading this, it seemed to me that his motive was really sexual sadism and watching a trapped, helpless woman. But you mentioned the first killing of a family. How does that connect?
Well, it wasn't intended for him to kill the father and son. He had worked at this plant in Wichita and seen this woman working there, right, and was attracted to her. He was married at the time, so he started this long process of what he called, stalking, trolling, finding a victim, then giving what he called the project a name. He called this one Little Mex because he saw that she had this young daughter.
Well, he saw that he thought they were Hispanic. Well,
right.
He knew they were Hispanic. He thought they were Mexicans. They were actually from Puerto Rico.
Right. So the whole plan was after the father and son had gotten out of the house that morning that he would go in and be able to control that situation fairly easily and kill them. But he had miscalculated because the father was there. All of them were trained in the martial arts. And they had a dog, so it's a rather extraordinary story how he was able to subdue them all, and then after killing the mother, the father, and the son, he did sort of, as you're saying, Alan, exercise sexual sadism with the girl. He hung her up in the basement, and then he masturbated, and this becomes the first leaving of DNA at a crime scene.
So what led him to this kind of a desire, do you think?
You mean desire to kill people and watch them die?
Yeah, like
watch
this whole, because he's getting into in a young age, he's getting into sexual fantasies of helpless women and stuff. But what drove him to actually go over and start torturing and hanging?
Well, I think like you said, he started when he was young. He knew that he was different from other kids. He had these strange fantasies. He was really fascinated by mummies because he liked the way they were all tied up. He got a hold of those True Detective magazines that were so popular back in the 50s and 60s, where the woman is, looking with horror into the camera as some shadowy figure off screen is, about to kill them. And then he started killing, young, small animals. And he liked to isolate it in barns where he could have the time to, watch as the life sucked out of them. And I think, like a lot of serial killers, he had to be, in order to get gratification, he had to be, gradually and exponentially increasing the thrill, so that, he had to move on to women. But like Steve said, he was surprised by the men in the house being there, the man and the boy, and this is when he was still in his, infancy days of learning and seeing what his mistakes were. And he found out with the Oteros that it was much harder to strangle a human being. After that, he had to start, practicing with these rubber balls so that his hands would get stronger.
Yeah, he tried to, he came from a very conventional background of his parents and three brothers in this small Kansas town, the sort I grew up in, heavily religious, repressive and all that. And you could just see him kind of trying to shove all this down. He goes into the army, following his father's footsteps. Maybe that'll help him. If he just gets married to the right woman, he'll be able to suppress all these instincts, or has a family. If he, joins the church that he grew up around, and he can't do it. It just builds up and builds up inside of him, and then it just comes out in these horrific crimes. So, if he'd gotten any sort of help at all, psychologically or in any way, it might have derailed some of it. But instead of doing that, he just, he hid from everyone. The only people that he ever told, who he was, I'm BTK, were those who were about to die at his hands.
And one of the psychologists interviewed in the book, I thought they had an interesting take on that. They said Dennis Rader could only be himself with his victims. They were the only ones that were able to see who he really was, this other side of him that he called Rex, or Factor X.
Right, and really to answer your question, from his point of view, he said that he was sort of demon-possessed. He couldn't really cope with the things that he was doing, so he would say this demon kind of entered into him, and he named it Rex, and he sort of drew it as a frog and all this stuff. He also, which I think is unusual probably in serial killers, is that he had all of these artistic impulses. He wanted to draw. He wanted to write.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he was in a very non-artistic, repressive type of place, which I can speak about. And so instead of sort of, maybe developing that in some way that would have helped him as being creative, it went into the darkest way possible. So then he would kill people, then he would make drawings of it, then he would write about it, or take photos of the dead. And it just came out in the most, negative way possible.
Do you think, what was the connection between him and his victims? Like, if he felt he could only be himself with those victims, was there something he was looking for in his victims?
Well, he was looking for, certain fairly obvious things. I want a single woman, so, that he kind of learned from the first situation or the second, that I don't want to stalk anybody where there's going to be a male in the house or resistance of that type. He was drawn to them physically. As time, and they were younger women, as time went on, his victims got older because younger people are harder to kill. So he was looking for someone in isolation, where a lot of sound, if sound was made, it wouldn't reach other people. And what he really wanted, which goes back to what Joyce said with the animals in the barn, is that he wanted a lot of free time to, bind, torture, and kill, not just kill.
Which is what he did with Maureen Hedge, the woman that he actually took to the church basement of Christ Lutheran Church. Yeah. And he had gone ahead of time and taped up, the windows with paper and masking tape, so that he could have the time. I think he drove her body he drove her in her own car, in the trunk of her own car, to that church basement in the middle of the night. And then he had plenty of time to pose her and photograph her.
Right. It was the only time probably where he had as much time as he wanted. One of the things that he did was he had this young son. Rader was a Cub Scout leader, so they would go on Cub Scout overnights. When the kids were asleep, he'd leave the Cub Scout camp and go do what Joyce just described. I mean, it's probably the single most, sort of grotesque scenario, where he's in the church as a member at that point, but he kills her, takes her in there, puts her in bondage positions, and takes a whole series of photographs.
And when he wasn't doing that with women, he was doing it to himself. He was going out to rural areas, stringing himself up in very elaborate, knots and ropes,
pulleys and ropes,
or putting a woman's mask with a blonde wig on himself, and digging like a shallow grave, and he had rigged up these photography ways of photographing himself, and so that he kept everything. He kept all these photographs. He kept all of his drawings. I mean, there was a lot of things that he kept in his what he called the motherlode, which they eventually found.
And he lived in a 900 square foot house, which is quite small if you can visualize that, with his wife and 2 children when they were growing up, and he kept other mementos and writings and drawings stashed away in that house in drawers that he had beneath the regular drawers. So he was constantly, reliving these, moments for him of killing people.
Well, it kind of sounds like he was really into the process and tried to, almost enjoy it. Like he wanted to savor a certain amount of time with his victims. So how was he able to stop all of a sudden?
Well, number one, he was getting older, and as Joyce alluded to, it became harder. It's hard to strangle people. That's the way he wanted to do it. He didn't want to shoot them or knife them to death.
It was too messy. He had to knife someone, and it was way too messy for him. He was a very meticulous, organized killer.
Yeah. So he was absolutely 100% into the process, as you put it. But the fact that he was getting older, at a certain point, he began to get some attention as BTK. This is another interesting angle. He killed the 4 Oteros, and then he killed 3 more people, and then he reached out to the media and the police again and said, why don't you put this in the paper? Why don't you, I'm giving myself a name, it's BTK, why can't I get some recognition? So the Wichita police initially said, we're not going to publicize any of this, and then they said, we think we should, because he just kept killing. So once he got that, he kind of backed off for several years.
But again, to your question, he also really enjoyed this fantasy life. He took great pains to dress up in different kinds of clothing, and he had the time, because the types of jobs that he had afforded him time. When he worked for ADT Security Systems, or as a compliance officer, he could go down streets, look for people, check out the backs of their houses, and he would dress up like, one time he dressed up like in a tweed outfit, kind of a la James Bond. And, so he really enjoyed that cat and mouse aspect to it, which he did later on with the detectives, with Detective Landwehr.
That's true.
Do you folks feel his stopping was also assisted by the vast collection of mementos that he had, so he could fantasize instead of having to go out and recommit crimes?
That's a really good point. We've never really been asked that. I never thought of that. That's a very good point.
That may be true. I think he followed law enforcement. Like certain people who are criminals, he sort of wanted to be in law enforcement, and he kind of had an admiration for the police. So I think he was very aware that when that death penalty came back, that he was going to be vulnerable.
It's so. What do you say about the law enforcement? Like, with so many killings in such a small city, kind of. What was the reasoning behind this? Why were they not able to lock in on him?
They were looking in the wrong place. They were looking in Wichita proper, and again, I didn't name the town, but it's called Park City. It's about 10 or 15 miles north of Wichita. Very similar to the community of 900 that I grew up in. It has about 6 churches, so saturated with religion. And the entire profile about who they were looking for was wrong.
And also, he changed his M.O. After the Oteros, he specifically went after. He did it a different way so that they would not think it was the same, person, and it bought him a little bit of time until they started connecting the dots.
Right. They would never ever have caught Dennis Rader if he hadn't essentially caught himself. Mm-hmm. So to advance the story a little bit, he apparently stops killing in 91. There is debate about that. Some think he killed people that we don't know about. But in 2004, the Wichita Eagle runs a story. The Oteros were killed in 1974, so it's 30 years later. And whatever happened to BTK? And a lot of speculation was that he was dead. So that Sunday morning in the Sunday Eagle, he picks up his newspaper, sits down with his cup of coffee and reads all these people saying, well, he's probably dead.
And also that somebody was going to be writing a book about it.
Right.
And he did not want someone else to be, writing his story. He kind of saw himself in this movie of himself.
Right.
BTK Productions, he named it. So
he said, I'm not dead. Maybe I should bring back BTK. And he started basically to work on that. His 8th victim was a woman named Vicki Wegerle in 1986, and he had also masturbated at that particular scene, and then one other. So as I said, there were 3 samples. He had taken her driver's license as a souvenir after killing her, and the police could never find where that was. So he took a photo of it, and then he sent it into the newspaper and said, I'm BTK. Here's a picture of her driver's license, so they knew that he was serious. The case was so cold at that point that the editors or the people at the Wichita Eagle didn't even open the letter for days. They just thought it was nothing. Then once they did, they took it to the police, and this instituted the BTK task force that I alluded to earlier.
Now, so when you talk about the Mindhunter series and stuff like that, why do you think they profiled them so wrong? Like, why were they so off?
Well, they simply weren't, they just had the wrong information. I mean, again, he was absolutely capable of fitting in, if you jump ahead to 2004, when he reads the article and reconnects with the police, he is a compliance officer in this little town, meaning he goes around and, checks on if dogs are running loose or things like that. He's the president of his congregation, the rock in the church, along with his wife, Paula. I mean, he fit in perfectly into that community, and there was never any sense that the killer was not in Wichita proper. Now, as he got older, he did start to kill women who were in his own community.
Even just down the block from him.
Yes, because he could stalk them more easily and figure out, and they were older, so he could kill them more easily. But the police just didn't, it wasn't just the police. I mean, they had the KBI, and they had the FBI, and they had all these specialists, And it just shows you, it takes a break sometimes to get close to a killer.
So now the break was, in a floppy disk. So maybe explain that.
Well, what happened was that in March, he read the article in January of 2004. In March of 2004, he starts sending out these communications to the police. And the police, led by Lieutenant Ken Land, were very, very astute in thinking if we don't, go on the air and say negative things about this guy, if we try and establish some sort of relationship through the media, he's going to want to continue to communicate with us. It was a very, interesting insight on their part because he did want to communicate with people. He did sort of want credit for what he'd done.
And sort of a camaraderie with law enforcement.
Right. Mm-hmm. So that they went back and forth. He would send in some communication. He'd say, here are the chapters of the book I'm going to write, or some little other souvenir from one of his crimes. And they would go back on the air and say, we'd really love to talk to you. That would be fascinating, very soft-core stuff. And over time, a certain, relationship did develop between Landwehr and between BTK. And then finally, and it's just almost unbelievable, BTK sends in a question basically to the police and says, if I were to use a floppy disk to communicate with you, would you be able to trace anything that's on that back to me? And guess what the police said? No. No, that would never happen, So he, as Joyce has pointed out in other contexts, he wasn't technologically astute. He had used like Xerox machines and stuff like that going back to the 70s to create documents, but he didn't know much about computers. So he sends it in. And
then they did the forensics on the properties.
Right.
And when they scrolled down for the properties, it said Christ Lutheran Church Dennis.
Yep.
And that's all they needed.
Within 10 minutes of getting the disc, they knew who he was. Which is not to say that they were ready to arrest him.
No, they had to dig some more, and they dug up his daughter Carrie's DNA at the university that she had attended, and for a gynecological exam, and that's how they got it.
Yeah, so it took them about a week or so from the time they figured out, who they were quite certain that he was. So they sent all of these undercover people to Park City. They were climbing telephone poles and tailing him around town and looking at his routine and all of that. But they had to wait, sort of unbearably long to get that DNA and then to get it tested.
Yeah.
And so when it came back and they got, a hit from her, they were ready to close in.
And he had been planning for his BTK finale. He wanted to get a woman, and he wanted to string her up, a la Silence of the Lambs, like they did with the security guard in that really horrific scene, where the body is just, up in the air, hanging.
Mm-hmm.
That was his grand finale, and luckily they got him before that.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, he that was going to be his swan song.
Yeah.
He was going to do it on October 22nd, 2004, which was 30 years to the day from when he sent that first letter into the media saying, I'm BTK and I want some credit for what I've done.
Wow. Almost proud
so
of it.
Yeah. So they waited on February 25th, 2005, again about a year since the task force starts, to let him go to work that morning, and then they followed him on his way home for lunch.
And because he was such a creature of habit, I mean, this is how meticulous and organized this guy was. He would come home from work to lunch. He wanted his wife to have that lunch ready every day at exactly, it was 12:17, right?
Yeah, he left at 12:15.
And it had to be on the table for him at 12:17. So
at about 12:16,
yeah.
the police pull him over, and he has absolutely no idea, that they're watching him.
Well, he had heard on the scanner that the FBI was in town, but he thought, well, if they are here after me, there's nowhere I can run to. So, he just was he was operating on the assumption that they were there, but not knowing who he was yet.
Right. So there were a number of arresting officers, and one was the detective that I mentioned when this conversation first started, who was a great source of information, again, about, we're talking about, well, he, sends in a few things and then he gets arrested. Not true. Those police were sitting on street corners night after night when the weather got really awful in early 2005, all pulling all-nighters because he would send in these communications at a certain address. So then they'd go back to the address and spend all night. Or they would go back to the cemetery where some of his victims were buried because he'd make an allusion to them. It was grueling, grueling work, and at times it seemed they would never catch him. So now they've got him, they pull him out, put him on the ground, and Lieutenant Landwehr is sitting in a car right there, and they take him over there, and Landwehr says, "Do you know why we're here?" And he says, "Yeah, I think I do." So it was a dramatic ending to his life as a free man.
Well, it's interesting too. I guess originally he pleaded not guilty, and it took him over almost 2 months before he changed it, and then he explained everything. What made him change all of a sudden, do you think?
Well, the extraordinary thing was, as we've talked about with you, is that he never told anybody. He was living right next to his wife, children, minister, coworkers, and he never told anyone anything ever about what he had done as a criminal. They took him that day down to the FBI building in downtown Wichita at about 1 p.m., and for the next 32 hours, he's talked nonstop to a rotating series of police officers and FBI agents. He told them probably 90% of what he had done. We don't know, but he talked for 32 straight hours. So he had, it just erupted. It was like, oh, now I have an audience, and these people really want to hear this. So it all came pouring out.
And he was proud of his work, his handiwork. He truly was.
Yeah. So he gradually, I think, evolved into realizing that, going to trial or pleading innocent or anything like that, well, they had his DNA and they had the disc. So he didn't really have a case, but it would be more grueling for his family, more grueling for the city of Wichita, and they had him dead to rights anyway. So he decided to confess, and that in itself became a spectacle.
So how did his wife take this, and they had no idea, the family?
No. According to his daughter's book, Carrie Rawson, they had no idea, and his wife was devastated, as you can imagine, and she left town, or she had to go stay with relatives, and then got a divorce very quickly, right?
Yeah. The church protected her a lot. She was a member of the choir in the church too, and I think they were sort of getting her in and out of town, away from the media. I mean, they were just totally devastated.
His brothers, he had 3 younger brothers.
Right.
They were in total denial about it. They said, "No way, you cannot have the right man. This is not who our brother is." So it took a while for them to, for it to sink in. But when he did that confession on national television, I think, that was it for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. There were a lot of people who thought that the police had made a false arrest in December of 2004, brought somebody in, turned out not to be BTK. So there was a lot of feeling around that, well, maybe they got the wrong guy again. And because he wasn't saying anything, it came to be June 27th, 2005, and he had to enter his plea in front of the judge. And so, with national media looking on and a lot of, viewers, he said, "Yes, I'm guilty." And the judge, said, "Are you sure of that?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm guilty." and the legal proceeding could have ended at that point. The judge could have said, okay, we'll sentence you in 6 weeks, which often happens. But he didn't do that. So what happened next is something unprecedented in the history of American television, in which the judge basically walked him through his 10 murders, and so he could show that he was the actual killer. And
by doing that, I think he did the community a great service by demystifying the urban myth that BTK had become. He wasn't this, this crazy, empowered madman. He was this bumbling, inarticulate, balding 60-year-old man, and it just took the air out of the sails for the community once they saw once he was unmasked.
There were a lot of people initially who thought the judge shouldn't have done that because you gave him a platform to talk about his crimes. But it was a cathartic moment. I mean, this community had been terrorized by him in one way or another for 3 decades. And after that was done, it was the right thing to do, just like Joyce said.
So now there's the rumors that he's killed others. Do you think that he had killed others and didn't admit to them, and we don't know?
That's a good question.
I think
that's a really good question.
We know pretty much that he stalked others. When the book came out in April '06, I was on CNN, Anderson Cooper. He did an hour on BTK, and we started hearing from people
through our website, StephenSingular.com, and that's when we got an email from an anonymous man, at first anonymous, in Wichita, who had a very interesting tale to tell.
Right. First, before that, simultaneously, there was a woman who came in and talked about how she'd gone out with a guy who fit this physical description in the 70s, and one night she heard these tires coming up her gravel driveway and her door, trying to be pulled open, and she absolutely thought that it was Rader, but he didn't get in the house. Then we heard from a man, and again, to go back to what I said, he confessed for 32 hours about all the things he did. So we thought, that's pretty much his story. This guy comes in and he says, well, there's a part of the story he left out, and that is that when he was young, about 20, he was this good-looking guy, and a livelier presence, and he would go to a place in Wichita where all the gay men went. But he was profoundly conflicted about his sexuality, and he couldn't, so he went out on a date with this guy that was contacting us, and in the middle of it, out of nowhere, he throws him down, ties him up, beats him up, and he made him dress like a woman because he said he couldn't be sexually satisfied unless he dressed up as a woman. Right. Remember? Yeah. So he talked about, and this really may go back to your original question, Alan, about some of the source of his conflict, rage, violence, etc. Because this guy that contacted us felt that maybe he was gay, he couldn't come to grips with any of this at all, and again, it just came out in the worst way imaginable. This fellow told us that there was a murder in 1969 of a gay man in Wichita, and all of those in the gay community felt that BTK, Rader at that point, was likely the killer. We don't know that. We're not saying that, but that was sort of the underlying feeling. But nothing ever happened legally with that, and then he evolved into what he became. But this guy thought, if he could somehow have dealt with himself, in that way, this might not have happened.
So now you're going to be on CNN again. Have you've done some sort of special for them for March?
Well, in November, CNN contacted us, and we went to Wichita, and I was a consultant, and Steve was on camera, And that show, I think, is going to air in March of this year. However, when we get the actual air date, we will put that on our website, which is stevensingular.com.
Right.
Fantastic. Now, what do you hope people get out of reading the book? What do you want them to take away?
Well, my takeaway is that you know, we've written about another serial killer who was much more of a common criminal. He was killing women and taking their money, and
that was in Kansas also.
That was there. To me, this is sort of the ultimate psychological serial killer story. You know, he was killing people because he could not come to grips with himself and who he was. And I mean, I just felt like, I mean, it's kind of silly to say this, but I always felt that in a different set of circumstances, these deaths might not have happened. If he'd gotten some help, if he'd come to terms with his sexuality, you know, if he had any understanding of himself at all, but he just went in the opposite direction.
And he never tried to get help for himself. He knew that he said that something was wrong with him, but he never sought out any kind of help.
He did. He said that very early on, that he knew that there was something wrong with him, and, you know, the police offered a hotline, you know, we'll help you, we'll get your help. You know, here he is with this minister who was an absolutely wonderful man named Michael Clark at the end of, you know, his road there in the church, and that man would have done anything for him. The denial of what you are inside, whatever you are, you know, you need to be. And, you know, not a criminal, but short of that, to me, that's the moral of this story. He tried to deny it through marriage, work, religion, military, everything imaginable. You know, maybe killing that gay man in 1969. You can't deny what you are and be healthy.
And what I got out of it after having to re-examine the case after so many years, because, you know, we have written quite a few other books, you know, since then. But when you go back and you look at it with a little bit of hindsight, it's very interesting that people try to place labels on why people kill. You know, the psychological aspect is what's always drawn Steve and I to these types of cases. Some people just say, they just label it as, it had to be evil. He was evil. And then you get the different psychologists' examinations of, you know, repression or, you know, definition of mental illness and what is the legal definition of mental illness. And like one of the people said one of the experts said in the book, and it's funny because even the experts disagree when it comes to, you know, the definition of mental illness and insanity. But when you kill 10 people, how could you be sane?
Yeah. There's no greater example of the compartmentalization of a life probably than this guy. You know, killing and then going home to wife and kids and somehow being able to separate. The only way he could do it was to say, there's a demon inside of me, which really doesn't wash. There might be a demon, you know, in that 10 minutes when you're killing somebody, might say that, but he would plan this months in advance, and he would go through the whole plan, elaborate plan. So it was just this complete refusal to, you know, to look at himself. And when they arrested him, you know, he was the FBI, they were investigating him, and he said, you know, I'm basically a nice guy, I've just got a couple of bad habits. I mean, that was his level of self-examination, you know, and so that to me was what I got out of it.
Fantastic. Now, you have the website. What's your website again?
It's www.steven with the PH, STEPHEN, singular, SINGULAR.com. And we always update that with what we're working on and, you know, upcoming appearances and television and movie, you know, information.
Fantastic. Now, the book we're talking about is Unholy Messenger. It's the life and crimes of the BTK serial killer. And our guests have been Stephen and Joyce Singular. We'll have that on our website as well, so people listening can do one click and pick up the book. Thank you guys for being here.
Well, thank you for having us.
Alan.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
To find find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll see you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.